This webinar is Avoiding Plagiarism with APA 7th edition. I'm Julie Johnson Archer with ACU's Online Writing Center. Welcome. As we get started, if you haven't already, please type your name, where you're joining from, and the program you're pursuing in Zoom's chat window. Before we get into this evening's webinar content, I do want to give you some information about ACU's Online Writing Center. So if you're new to the Writing Center, we've got a lot of good resources for you, including webinars like this one. We record all our webinars and you can have access to these slides, which you can download and refer back to later. So if you have any questions throughout this presentation, or if you want me to go over something again, please put those in the chat box in Zoom and I will answer your questions as we go. So here we have a video how-to guide for making an appointment with us and submitting your paper to get some feedback on your writing. And tutors in our Writing Center work with you at any stage of your writing, whether you are just barely getting an outline for a paper or it's a final draft and you're feeling pretty confident. So anywhere in between, we'll work with you gladly on your writing and we'll give you feedback. Right now, all of our appointments are asynchronous. And what that means is that you upload your paper to us and we will send you feedback via email within 24 hours. So you don't need to be present at the time of your appointment. We'll give it to you via email. However, if you would like to request a phone or Zoom appointment, you can always request that by emailing us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu, and we will do our best to accommodate those requests. As things get busier throughout the term, we will probably be relying mostly on asynchronous appointments. And throughout the holiday season, the Thanksgiving break coming up, we might offer some tutoring, but you might also expect it to take a little longer than 24 hours, especially if it's right there on Thanksgiving Day. We have, among other resources, sample papers, blog posts. You can access those on our website. And if you're just joining us, welcome. You haven't missed anything. We're just about to get started. So here is how to submit to the Writing Center to have a tutoring appointment. First, you'll schedule an appointment with us here at this link, WC Online, and you'll save your spot in our schedule. Then you'll submit your paper to that week's Canvas box, and then you'll wait and you'll receive feedback from your tutor within 24 hours, again via email. All right, so we have 3 learning objectives for this webinar. The first is source integration and becoming familiar with source integration. What that means is incorporating others' research into your own writing. Our second objective is to strengthen source integration skills by thinking about how to use quotations, how to paraphrase effectively, and how to summarize others' ideas. Lastly, avoiding plagiarism. And really this objective is woven throughout all the other 2. But we will take a look at some examples of plagiarism and talk about how to ensure that doesn't happen in your papers. Many times we avoid the subject of plagiarism. We don't like talking about it. We don't like seeing it, especially if it's in feedback on our own writing. But I think it's so important to talk about it openly and talk about ways to avoid plagiarizing, especially using APA and APA resources to help you. And we all could use these reminders again and again as we practice and get better at avoiding plagiarism and, in fact, integrating sources into our papers with more and more skill. So props to you for listening in. You are already on your way. So there's no getting around the simple fact we all must use the ideas and discoveries of others in our writing for coursework. In order to support our claims and present strong arguments, academic writers must incorporate evidence from reliable sources. So how do we do that well? We are going to cover in this webinar how you can use quotations, paraphrases, and summaries to share source material in your work. So let me spend a few moments thinking about the first objective with you, understanding ethical source integration. When thinking about incorporating information from reliable sources, it's helpful to put it into the frame of creating a conversation. As you grow as a writer at ACU, I hope you keep in mind this nuanced perspective. With every paper you write, you are entering into a larger conversation. And when I say conversation, I don't mean a literal discussion post, perhaps in your Canvas course, or a phone texting conversation. What I'm referring to is the ongoing discourse among researchers and scholars in your field. For example, let's say you're writing about the topic of access to online higher education. You can be certain that you are not the first to write about that topic. Others have already researched it from different perspectives or theories, and it's important to acknowledge what they've found and show how your ideas build on, differ from, or otherwise fit into the larger discourse on your topic. Most of your assignments in your courses at ACU require you to use sources to get full credit. You may also be asked to synthesize the course materials or go find a number of outside sources to use in your papers. What I encourage you to do when faced with this task is think of it not only as a requirement on the rubric, but as an opportunity to enter into the conversation, the larger discourse about your topic. So now let's think about how this perspective will impact your papers. While you may not write about every single thing that's been said under the sun about a certain topic, that sort of thing is really reserved for long, extended literature reviews. Consider how you can develop your paper as a smaller sub-conversation within the larger discourse. So to do this, begin paying attention to a few things, or increase your attention to these things. First, the balance of your own voice versus the voice of others. Something I see fairly often in the Writing Center is that when asked to synthesize multiple sources and what they say on a topic, students will almost make a laundry list in their writing of all the things that have been said. They'll write, Thompson et al. Found this, while Young said that. But according to Garcia, this, and so forth. What happens is that the sources begin to dominate the paper, and we lose sight of the main ideas of you, the writer. And as the author of your papers, pay attention to the balance between your ideas and those of others, and try to ensure that your voice is loud and clear. Second, keep an eye on the instinct to let a source speak for itself. This is another really common instinct. It might be tempting to plop a really poignant quote into your paragraph and let it prove something to your audience. The problem with this is that if you leave the interpretation of that quote up to your audience, they may have a whole different interpretation. And suddenly, it's unclear what you meant for your reader to take away from that quote. The way to avoid this common issue is to always explain or analyze why a quote is relevant and how it connects to your main idea. This is called analysis, and it really takes practice. If you practice analyzing every quote in your paper, though, this will help balance your voice with others' voices in your paper. And we have an excellent webinar recording on the Writing Center's website specifically addressing how to add an analysis and synthesis to your writing. I hope you'll check that out if you're interested in that topic more. Okay, third, when you're thinking about your paper as a conversation between your ideas and those of others, keep an eye on the tendency to isolate source material. So again, this means that rather than having a whole paragraph of quotes, paraphrases, and ideas from others, you should blend in your own analysis and ensure that every piece of information from other sources is fully incorporated into your paragraph and its purpose is explained. This way, your reader not only understands the source material, but can see how it relates to the point you're trying to make in that paragraph and hopefully to the purpose of your whole paper. So in every paper you write, consider how your voice and analysis can blend with the voices of other experts to uniquely develop a new conversation that contributes to the scholarship in your field. A quick tip before we get into the particulars of using quotations. When selecting a quote or crafting a paraphrase, it's important to be strategic. Don't simply use a quote because you feel like you haven't used one in a while. Make sure you include quotes in your paragraphs to add support, details, and clarity to your argument. I'm getting a notice that my slides might not be moving. Let me reshare. Thank you so much. Give me one moment. Okay, so you should see this slide with some quotes on it. Let me know if you don't see that. And now, what is a quotation? Is what you should see on the screen. Thank you for letting me know. All right, so we're going to get into quotations now, the practical side of all of this. So a quotation consists of someone else's exact words enclosed in quotation marks or set off as a block from the rest of your text. Quotations should be used sparingly and strategically, like I mentioned, in order to support your argument. As a general rule, you want to avoid large blocks of quoted text. So here's an example of a quote that's been incorporated into a sentence in APA style. In order to succeed as an academic writer, it is essential that students quote or reproduce materials that readers will find especially convincing, purposeful, and interesting, end quote. And here at the end, we have our citation in APA style. We've got the authors, the year of publication, and the page number. So here are some general rules for when to use direct quotations in your papers. Keep in mind that you should always defer to your professor's instructions and preferences, so if they ask you not to have any direct quotes, of course you'll want to follow those instructions. But in general, you want to use direct quotations when something is said so well and convincingly that it's worth repeating. Perhaps it's a really beautiful quote, and if you take it and try and put it into your own words, something is lost. You can also use direct quotations when the original author's authority on the subject lends credibility to your argument. So let's say you are quoting from a really prominent scholar in your field. If you include a quotation from them, that shows that you are listening to that scholar, and it actually can help improve your credibility to show that you are referring to that scholar. You can use direct quotations if you think the passage's meaning will be altered or unclear if you paraphrase it, or if you are introducing an opposing position, in other words, a counter-argument. So if you're providing something that you disagree with, sometimes it's better to include a direct quote of that perspective so that they can be sure that you're not misquoting or misreading that argument. So to incorporate a direct quote correctly in APA 7th edition, you have these two options. The first is a narrative, or what we call a signal phrase, and this is where you cite the author and the year in the sentence itself. So here we've got a template For that, you can follow in your papers. For example, Jones, 2015, stated, quote, 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 and the page number that quote comes from. The other option that's also equally correct in APA is called a parenthetical citation. And this is where you put all of that information, the author, year, and the page number, at the end of that sentence in parentheses. So for example, the experts found, quote, 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 open parentheses, Jones, comma, 2015, comma, page 12 through 13, end parentheses, and then we have that period to show, okay, this sentence includes this citation. So one of the most common errors that I see in the Writing Center is students dropping quotes into the middle of a paragraph. If you ever receive Writing Center feedback from me, you've probably seen a note to avoid dropped quotes. What this means is that a full quote has been plopped into the middle of a paragraph with no introduction and no analysis. So instead, here are some ways to fully incorporate a quote into your writing that aren't so abrupt. Mention the author's name and perhaps their affiliation. Again, if they're a really prominent scholar, you might mention their name and their title or where they work. Use a simple signal phrase to frame the quote. According to this person is an example. Don't forget your citation, and for quotations, you always include a page number. Now, if you're working with a source that doesn't really have page numbers, you can count the paragraph numbers. Or perhaps if you are using a video, you can also give the timestamp as a substitute for the page number. A helpful way to remember these tips is to think of it as a quotation sandwich. So you might think of the top slice then as the signal phrase with the author's name. The quote is the meat, it comes in the middle. Or if you are vegan, great, it's all those veggies. And make sure you use quotation marks around that quoted material. Anything that is not your own words needs quotation marks at the beginning and the end. The bottom slice is your explanation of the quote and its connection to the paragraph's topic, sentence, or your main idea. If you're having some trouble thinking of good signal phrases to use, we've got this resource for you. Again, you can refer back to these slides from the Writing Center's website. So this list of strong verbs can be helpful because if you use the same signal phrases over and over, your writing can become repetitive and it's likely to even start sounding robotic and less like you. So instead of Jones said, Ward said, Hernandez said, switch it up by using stronger verbs. Jones argued, Ward defined, Hernandez rejected, and so forth. So here are a few examples of strong signal phrases in action. According to Smith, 2011, most cats enjoy sunbathing in the early morning. Now, these examples are actually using paraphrases. They're not direct quotes, but they've still got the signal phrase, right? According to Smith. Jones, 2019, affirmed. Carlin's 1999 research rejected. All right, so those are good examples of using signal phrases really effectively. So let's take a look at this example of a dropped quote on the left side of the screen. This quote is like a ship without an anchor. So another simile for those language people or visual learners in the audience. So you can see that if you're reading along, we've got a sentence from the author, and then abruptly we begin the next sentence with a quotation, and that sentence is only a quotation. There's no explanation at the end either. of how that quote is important. So on the right, we have an example of how to avoid that phenomenon of dropping a quote. This quote is anchored, meaning it's clear to the reader why it's included. So we've got a sentence leading into the quote, but then the beginning of that sentence that includes the quotation has a signal phrase. It's got some information about the author, if that is important to note. And we've kind of got even a summary of what Turner, in this case, is saying before we even lead into that quote. So that explains what we should be paying attention to when we read that quote. It gives all of that information to the reader and doesn't leave it up to the reader to kind of guess why we included that quote. So take a moment now to consider how you would take this highlighted quote from the source and introduce it in your paper. So I've given you the author, the date, and the page number. Think about how you might construct a sentence with this direct quote and this citation information. So yours can look different from mine, of course, but here is an example of how you can incorporate it into a sentence. Rowland, 2018, cautioned against, quote, a single dimension approach to understanding individuals, end quote, page 72. So if you have any questions about what I've covered so far on quotations, let me know in the chat room. We are going to now move on to paraphrasing. So first, what is a paraphrase? Paraphrasing is when you include details of a passage in your own words and syntax. Just like with quotes, paraphrases must include citations. These are other people's ideas still. So here's an example of what paraphrases look like. We've got a quote here to show here's the original text. It's from Jones in 2017 from this page. And here's an example of that paraphrase. Jones 2017 stated that students must develop their quoting and paraphrasing skills in order to become scholarly writers. Now, when I read the original quote, you can hear this is the same idea, but it sounds different. The original quote says, learning how to quote and paraphrase correctly is part of being a successful academic writer. So hearing the difference there can show you, all right, not only is this paraphrasing using different wording, it sounds a bit different too. The grammar of the sentence has been restructured. When you paraphrase, unlike quoting, you can control what details you want to emphasize and for what purpose in your paper. For instance, if I'm writing a paper on student development, I might paraphrase the previous quote a little differently, like this. Jones, 2017, emphasized the importance of students developing quoting and paraphrasing skills. Here I emphasize the author. Jones, 2017 is right there at the beginning of my paraphrase. Perhaps I wanted to do that because Jones is a good scholar. Maybe it was in the course reading from that week and I want to highlight that yes, I did the reading and here's what Jones said. But let's say I'm writing a more general paper or paragraph about scholarly writing and I don't need to call attention to the author or who said it originally. In that case, this second paraphrase shows how I can emphasize the main idea and keep the focus on the content of that original source. Quoting and paraphrasing skills are an important component of scholarly writing. Jones 2017 is my in-text citation there. So these both accurately represent Jones's original idea, which you can see here. But when I paraphrase, I have control over how to incorporate that idea in a way that's relevant to my paper and what I'm writing. Jones had their own purpose for writing that original sentence, as any author has their own purpose for their sentences. And they have their own audience in mind as well. So you can pretty much guarantee that your audience is different, your purpose is different from the original authors. So paraphrasing takes that into account and allows me to put this idea into my context and give it to my audience in a way that I think helps them understand my ideas or my argument. So why should you use paraphrasing more than direct quoting? Paraphrasing is really important in scholarly writing for a few reasons. First, it allows you to maintain control over your essay. Overquoting can result in a loss of your own voice and even a loss of your credibility as a writer. If all you do is repeat what others have said, your voice will not be present, and your reader could even get lost in trying to understand your main idea. Paraphrasing shows off your knowledge and understanding of the ideas you're sharing. So before you can put someone else's ideas into your own words, you really need to understand their idea, so much so that you can restate it as if you were teaching someone else about that idea in your paper. It requires careful attention, and it's a skill we can all get better at, thankfully, with practice. Lastly, this is a skill that good rhetorical writers use, but it's also one we all already use all the time. Based on our context, we all know how to paraphrase our thoughts when asked, "How are you doing today?" If you're standing in line at the store, you might cut down how much you say, as opposed to a longer version you might give to a friend or partner at the end of a long day. In writing, it's a very similar skill. Based on your audience and the context of your paper, paraphrasing allows you to maintain the focus of your ideas and pick and choose what ideas of others are most relevant and necessary to include, and which ones you're not going to include. So here are some rules of thumb for when to use a paraphrase. Paraphrasing should be your go-to method, not quoting, as I've explained. Paraphrase when the details of a passage are significant to support your argument, but the exact wording is not. So for example, if you're discussing the phrasing of a legal definition, you would probably need to directly quote that definition to maintain accuracy. But if you just need to capture someone's idea, you should paraphrase it. And then paraphrase when presenting complex and/or technical ideas where it would be clearer if presented in your own voice. So sometimes you might be writing about these complex or technical ideas, and in that case, you're paraphrasing the main idea of that quote can go a long way in helping your reader understand and follow along. Think about if you're reading a passage and you suddenly see a long quote full of complex wording. It's difficult to understand. Maybe there's jargon in there. It would have probably been better for the writer of that paper to have you in mind and go ahead and put it into their own words so that you can follow along more easily with their main claim. So again, paraphrasing shows off your own understanding to your readers, and if your primary reader is your professor, that's a really good thing to do. So now we're getting into the practical side of paraphrasing and how to do it without accidentally plagiarizing. So paraphrasing is not simply changing a few words in a sentence. When it's done correctly, paraphrasing is used as a way to establish credibility as a writer and support claims in your own voice. So this is another slide that you might want to refer back to, keep on hand, because it's a step-by-step process for paraphrasing. If you follow these steps and make them a habit, you can trust that your paraphrases will be quality paraphrases and not include any accidental plagiarism. So step number 1, reread the original passage that you have selected several times. The goal here is to fully understand the concept. 2, set aside the original text and write your paraphrase on a note card or in your paper, wherever you're writing. Looking away here is important. You want to look away from the original text because you don't want your version to sound the same as the original. You want to try to use different words and change up the order of the words, the order of the idea as you're writing. Step 3, check your rendition against the original to make sure that your version accurately expresses all of the essential information in a new form. So did you present the same idea correctly? Step 4, review your paraphrase for originality. If your paraphrase is still too similar, try changing the sentence structure. Then write a paraphrase of your paraphrase. Check the meaning once again. I really want to encourage you not to skip this step. This is where ineffective paraphrases will stop. They'll often submit a paper. They haven't checked their paraphrase a second time to make sure that it doesn't sound too close to the original. And often Turnitin will flag these paraphrases because they're too similar to the original. They're ineffective and ultimately lead to plagiarism. One thing that ACU students can use is the Writing Center's Turnitin checker, and this will not count against your similarity score. It allows you to look over that Turnitin similarity report and go ahead and see, oh, did I miss any of these paraphrases? Are they too close? Being highlighted as too close to another source. Step 5, use quotation marks to identify any unique term or phraseology that you have borrowed exactly from that source. So it's possible to do both direct quoting and paraphrasing in the same sentence. Lastly, cite the source according to APA formatting. And a quick note here, keep your own comments, elaborations, or reactions separate from the paraphrase itself. So when you're crafting a paraphrase, it should clearly and objectively reflect the source material. I know some students like to copy and paste quotes from their reading into a Word document to use while they're writing that week's essay. And that's fine as long as you don't forget to provide citations and put those ideas in quotation marks so that there's no question later on when maybe after a day or two you come back to your notes and you might have forgotten which words there are directly from your sources. So let's take a look at an example. Here we have a sentence that I'd like to include in my paper. Here's that sentence. The air sampling methods chosen and tested in the present study were 3 of the most widely used methods previously reported. I don't really like how this is worded. I don't need to include it exactly like how the original author did. So I'm going to paraphrase it. Cote et al. 2019 evaluated 3 commonly used methods documented in the literature. This paraphrase captures the main idea of the quote, and it includes a citation in APA, the authors, and the year. Note, I haven't included a page number because in APA, you're only required to use or incorporate a page number if you have directly quoted from that source. So here's an example of how paraphrasing can be done incorrectly, resulting in plagiarism even if it's accidental. So we've got this quote as an example. I'll read the first part of it. Quote, students frequently overuse direct quotation in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. And the quote continues. Let's look at an ineffective paraphrase of that material. Listen for how this paraphrase sounds too similar to the original. Students often use too many direct quotations when they take notes, resulting in too many of them in the final research paper. In fact, probably only about 10% of the final copy should consist of directly quoted material. All right, so there are two major problems with this paraphrase. The paraphrase sounds very similar to the original. So it begins, students frequently overuse. Our paraphrase says students often use too many, right? So that's the same idea. And maybe they subbed in often instead of frequently, when they take notes instead of in taking notes. As a result is switched with resulting, and so on. You can see how these, maybe this author just tried to plug in synonyms for different words of the original quote. The other issue with this paraphrase is that there's no citation. There's no credit given to the original author. So let's look at how to correct those errors with a proper paraphrase. So beneath the quote, we have this new paraphrase, and let's listen. In research papers, students often quote excessively, failing to keep quoted material down to a desirable level. Since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it is essential to minimize the material recorded verbatim. Lester, 1976. All right, so we've got new words to describe this idea. It is still the same idea, which is good. We want to reflect the original author's meaning with our paraphrases, but we've got a different sentence structure. It sounded different than the original because we switched up how we portrayed those ideas. We've also got a citation, which is absolutely necessary for every paraphrase. So now it's time to practice and try your hand at paraphrasing. I'm going to read this quote once, and then I'll give you a moment to think of a good way to paraphrase this idea and give a proper citation. So here's the quote. Cats have different dialects, and their vocalizations vary from country to country. The sounds made by cats do differ significantly from breed to breed in terms of emphasis and tone, similar to regional dialects, although their basic vocabulary is the same. We've got information about the author, Alderton, when it was published, 2016. Take a moment and try and paraphrase this idea into your own words. Let's take a look at one example of a paraphrase, and yours should look different from mine because everyone's paraphrases will sound like their own unique voices. Here's one example. Alderton, 2016, examined the role of dialectical variations in cats. A notable finding was that cat sounds differ based on breed and country of origin. Even though cats share essentially the same vocabulary, they do display differences in intonation and emphasis, just like humans differ in regional dialects. Alderton, 2016, again. So here we've got a lot of good things to look at. We've got signal phrases, Alderton examined. A notable finding was this. And that kind of phrase, a notable finding, highlights something that we're calling the reader's attention to from this original text. And as you listened, I hope you could tell it sounded different than the original text. It's a bit more explanatory, and you can imagine that this is different, again, based on the context of my paper and who is reading it. Alderton definitely had a different audience, probably, than my audience. So at this point, we're going to briefly talk about summary. If you have any questions about paraphrasing, how to do it correctly, just let me know in the chat room. So what is a summary and how is it different from paraphrasing? A summary contains the points of a passage that are important to your purpose and leaves out other details. Summaries are significantly shorter than the original and take a broad overview of the source material. So summarizing involves putting the main ideas into your own words, but including only the main points. So it's pretty similar to paraphrasing, but you're cutting it down. Like quoting or paraphrasing, it's necessary to attribute summarized ideas to the original source. So you always provide a citation for a summary, just as you would for a paraphrase. In general, you should use summaries when the main point is important to supporting your argument, but the details are not. Also, when condensing large sections of text, for example, many students are required to write an annotated bibliography, where you're taking a potentially long journal article and summarizing it in very few words, maybe even just one paragraph. So this is a specific skill that you will be developing in order to write an annotated bibliography successfully. You also want to use summaries when you're highlighting just the main ideas of a section of text. You're not referring to specific details from the paragraphs. Perhaps you're just summarizing a whole section of a text. Everything we've focused on in this webinar is really to help us avoid plagiarism. So for the next few minutes, we're going to dig into that topic in greater detail. It's our third objective. So first, let's think about what is plagiarism. Plagiarism is when a writer presents another author's work as their own, and plagiarism often occurs accidentally. When we are learning about how to use APA, learning to incorporate others' work into our writing, it can be accidental. And we recognize this, but it's still very serious and worth learning about to avoid. Accidental plagiarism most often occurs when paraphrasing. This results in a type of patchwork writing or patchwork plagiarism that blends the student's writing with the author's writing and does not include citations. So this kind of paraphrasing, like we saw with the ineffective paraphrasing earlier, it's when you take words and just plug in synonyms instead. Or if you forget to provide a citation, again, that's accidental plagiarism. Plagiarism also includes leaving out an in-text citation or a quotation or a paraphrase. So plagiarism also includes leaving out an in-text citation for a quotation or a paraphrase, even if you include the quotation marks themselves. So we've created a short video on how to use Turnitin to avoid plagiarism and how to interpret the Turnitin similarity score, how to interpret what Turnitin is highlighting. So I do recommend you watch that video on our YouTube channel. Here are 3 key ways to make sure you avoid accidentally plagiarizing when you're paraphrasing. 1. After crafting a unique paraphrase, always compare it against the original text to ensure originality. Again, like I said earlier, you can use Turnitin here to help you do that double checking. If Turnitin highlights a long string of words, you want to definitely make sure that you check the original source. And if it is the same wording, you go back in and re-paraphrase. Another step, go beyond searching for synonyms. Rearrange the sentence structure of your paraphrase and use your own voice to make it more original. Remember, you are including that quote or that idea into your paper for your own purpose. You're arguing a point, and this person said something that helps you make your point even better. So remember your purpose when you're writing and include your own voice. Write it in your own unique way so that it doesn't sound abruptly like someone else's voice. Suddenly, your paper has a good flow with your own voice. And lastly, always cite paraphrases and ideas that originated from another source, even if they're written in your own words. So here is an example that you might see in Turnitin. On the left of the screen, we've got the source text, the original writing from, it looks like maybe a textbook. On the right side of the screen, we have a student's work, and that's been submitted to Turnitin. And you can see that it has highlighted the majority of this paragraph, and it matches directly with the original text. This is a clear instance of patchwork plagiarism. There are no quotation marks around any words that are coming from the original text. There's also no citations. Also, there's no analysis, like I mentioned before. Anytime you incorporate someone else's words and ideas into your text, it should be for your own purpose and require some explanation of why that information is important to consider for your context. Here's another example. We've got source text on the left and the student work on the right. Now, in this instance, we see different colors, and Turnitin will highlight sentences or phrases from different sources using different colors, just like this. So here we can see there are a few issues. The red highlights here match the source text, but then the other colors match different texts that are either published out there, they're online. Turnitin has matched these as too similar to other sources. So there are a few significant problems here. First, there are multiple quotes that this student hasn't given any credit for. You don't see any in-text citations. Also, there's no explanation or analysis of these ideas, again, just like in the previous example. So remember, the goal is to strategically pick and choose source materials to include between your own sentences that further your claims. Now, this material is more for our graduate and doctoral students. When you have reason to have really long chunks of text, or even include tables, figures, or instruments in your writing, you need to know about APA's standards for when to ask permission to quote, reprint, or adapt those materials. So again, this is usually not required for a homework assignment or a course paper, but published works, thinking about dissertations, doctoral projects, almost always incorporate material that's been adapted or reprinted. So it's your responsibility as the writer to find out if permission is required to print or electronically reuse the source material. The ACU library can help with tracking down who to ask for permission and to get that copyright information. And also, the APA manual, section 8.34, has a lot of helpful information for how to know when to ask permission and then what to do once you receive permission. All right, so that concludes the bulk of the content of this webinar. I have a little bit more information here about upcoming webinars and resources that you have available to you as an ACU student. Again, if you have any questions about plagiarism, what consists of plagiarism, how to quote or paraphrase, I encourage you to ask those questions now. So some upcoming webinars on Tuesday, November 17th, psychology reflection papers. Many programs even those outside of our psychology program, require you to incorporate theory into your own reflections and have a reflective writing assignment. So this webinar will use a specific assignment from the undergraduate psychology program, but it will be applicable to many other programs that also incorporate reflection and theory-driven arguments in your papers. Right after that webinar, we have doctoral writing as a nurse, writing about health promotion. And this is part of a series for our DNP students. Also in that series, proofreading your final project paper draft, that's on the 24th. This will be a good one for the doctoral students who are far along in their program. You can see our full webinar archive on the Writing Center's website. We've got a lot of Writing Center webinars that are geared towards multiple programs, as well as undergraduate and graduate writing. As an ACU student, you have access to the ACU library, all of our library databases, and these, of course, you'll be using to access scholarly sources that you will then incorporate into your papers. The Writing Center has provided ACU students with an APA template, which you can download from this link and open up in Microsoft Word and go ahead and use, knowing that your paper will be fully formatted in APA as soon as you start typing. Also, we have a fairly new YouTube channel, which you can access at this link. If you have writing-related questions, maybe you don't want to make a full appointment with the Writing Center, you can ask your questions to us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu, and we will do our best to answer your questions in a timely manner. Again, schedule an appointment with us at WC Online and visit our Writing Center's website for access to a lot more resources. All right, I hope this information has been helpful to you. Good luck and keep writing.